For centuries, we've wrestled with one of the biggest questions a society can ask itself. Should the state have the power to end a human life as punishment? Now, this isn't just some dry legal issue. It's a huge debate about justice, morality, and where we draw the line on state power. Today, we're going to dive deep into this by staging a philosophical showdown. So, does the state have the right to take a life? That's the question at the heart of it all. And it's not a new one. You know, the entire modern debate was pretty much framed centuries ago by two intellectual giants. And their arguments? They're the foundation we're still building on today. So yeah, we're staging a philosophical showdown between two thinkers who, even with a century separating them, are basically still in conversation with each other. Their arguments are the absolute bedrock of every single debate on capital punishment you've ever heard. All right, in one corner, we have Cesare Beccaria, the Enlightenment challenger who argued passionately to get rid of it. And in the other corner, John Stuart Mill, the great utilitarian philosopher who actually mounted a powerful defense of the death penalty. We've got two brilliant minds with two completely opposite conclusions.
Let's start with Beccaria. He's writing back in 1764, and he wants to build a justice system based purely on reason, not on revenge or just how things have always been done. And for him, everything, and I mean everything, started with an idea called the social contract.
So, Beccaria's whole take on how a state even gets its power is absolutely crucial to his argument. He basically said, look, we all agree to give up tiny little bits of our personal freedom to create laws that protect everyone. You know, we give up the freedom to just do whatever we want so that we can all live in a safe, organized society. But, and this is a big but, there's a limit to what we can give away.
And this right here, this is Beccaria's masterstroke. He asks a simple question. Could any person, when they're sacrificing those small bits of freedom, ever hand over the right to their own life? He says no way. Absolutely not. Life is the greatest of all good. It's not something you can just logically or morally sign away. And if one person can't give that right away, well then how can a collection of people, the state, suddenly have it?
So for Beccaria, the conclusion is just inescapable. The death penalty isn't an act of justice that comes from the rights of the people. Nope, it's something else entirely. It's an act of war, where the state turns its full might against one of its own citizens.
Okay, so fast forward about 100 years, and John Stuart Mill steps into the ring with a really powerful and honestly kind of shocking rebuttal. He's not going to argue about rights based on a social contract. No, he's coming at this from the perspective of what creates the greatest good for the most people and the least amount of suffering.
Now this is where things get really interesting, because Mill just flips the entire argument on its head. The abolitionists are all saying the death penalty is cruel and inhumane, and Mill comes back and says, no, you've got it backwards. I'm defending it because it's the most humane option. I know, that sounds completely nuts. So, how does he get there?
Well, Mill says we have to separate what a punishment seems like from what it actually is. He calls the death penalty a short pang, right? It's over in a moment. But the alternative, life in prison, he calls a living tomb. Think about it, a life of endless, hard, boring labor with zero hope of ever getting out. In terms of the actual suffering a person endures over a lifetime, Mill says life in prison is way, way crueler.
And this is Mill's killer insight. For a punishment to really work as a deterrent, it doesn't need to be the absolute cruelest thing in reality, it just needs to be the most terrifying thing in our imagination. The death penalty, he argues, gets you maximum terror with minimum actual suffering. It's kind of the perfect deterrent.
So this brings us right to the central clash in their philosophies. What actually stops a person from committing a terrible crime? They both agree deterrence is the whole point, but they have completely different ideas about how you achieve it.
For Beccaria, the biggest deterrent is something you can see, something that's always there. It's the constant, ongoing misery of a prisoner. But for Mill, it's the exact opposite. The real power is in what you can't see, the terrifying, unknown finality of death that just looms in your mind.
Okay, let's just walk through Beccaria's logic here. He says a quick execution is a terrible but momentary spectacle. It happens and then people forget about it. But seeing a man condemned to what he calls perpetual slavery is a constant reminder. A regular person looks at that miserable prisoner and thinks, wow, that will be my entire life if I cross that line. That long-term, visible suffering, Beccaria believes that's the real deterrent.
Mill just completely disagrees. He says we shouldn't even be measuring deterrence by its effect on hardened criminals who are already used to risking their lives. No, the real power of the death penalty is its effect on the rest of us, the innocent. From the time we're kids, it creates what he calls an awful association in our minds, surrounding the act of murder with this unique kind of horror that no other punishment can ever match.
And right here, Mill throws down a challenge that is still incredibly potent today. How do you prove deterrence works? I mean, we can count the people who weren't deterred, obviously, but it's impossible to count the people who were, the ones who never committed murder in the first place because of that awful association they grew up with. How do you count a non-event?
So let's bring all this together. What we have are two really powerful, competing visions of what justice is. And this leads us to the final crucial questions. What message does the punishment send, and what happens when the system gets it wrong?
Beccaria is just horrified by the hypocrisy of it all. He's asking, how can the laws, which are supposed to prevent murder, go out and publicly commit murder themselves? He calls it an example of barbarity. But Mill sees the exact opposite. He argues that by taking the life of a murderer, the state is showing its ultimate, most emphatic respect for human life. It's declaring that life is so sacred that anyone who dares to take it forfeits their own right to exist.
Okay, but what about the biggest modern argument against the death penalty? The risk of executing an innocent person. Mill doesn't dodge this at all. He calls it a serious objection. And he totally gets that an execution is a mistake you can never, ever fix. But he offers this really counterintuitive defense. He says the very finality of the death penalty makes everyone in the system, judges, juries, everyone, incredibly careful. The stakes are so high, he argues, that they're going to scrutinize the evidence far more closely than they would for any other crime. So, let's just do a final rundown of this philosophical showdown. Where Beccaria starts with the social contract, Mill starts with utility, what works best. This leads them to completely opposite ideas about deterrence. Beccaria sees it in the duration of suffering, while Mill sees it in the power it has over our imagination. Beccaria calls death barbaric, but Mill argues it's actually less cruel than a life in prison. And finally, the message the state sends. For Beccaria, it's an example of barbarity. For Mill, it's the ultimate respect for life.
So the whole clash really boils down to this. Is justice a contract that we enforce with visible, constant examples, or is it a psychological tool, one that uses our deepest fear of the unknown to keep us all safe?
I mean, Beccaria and Mill laid out these arguments with incredible clarity, and even now, their questions are still our questions. As we continue to debate the death penalty today, we are still wrestling with their legacies. So, the final question really is for you. 2 centuries later, whose vision of justice do you think we should be following?